Okay, let's see how this goes. A little out of practice after our break, but gotta do it. The first couple slides here will be a review. I'll move through them really quickly, and then I'll move into the Roosevelt administration. Some people say Roosevelt, but if you're from the East Coast, I'm not. I'm from Michigan. But people say Roosevelt. I think that's actually the right way to say it. Roos. So I'll go through and talk about the his administration, that man, and some of the things that happened during the New Deal. And the important thing to remember here is you're not going to remember all of this stuff, but if you know the big picture and if you understand the larger ideological trends, you can figure out the details, right? Like if you know that one of the things that Roosevelt, the administration attempted to do was to modernize rural areas and the South in particular, you're probably going to figure out what the Tennessee Valley Authority was, right? Like you'll get it. If you know that a lot of people were out of work and the Roosevelt administration tried to put people back to work, you'll figure out what the WPA did, or the CCC or whatever, right? So you want to go from the kind of top down, not from the bottom up. Uh, Unlike the tax policy of the New Deal. Okay, review. This is review. We did this in the last lecture here. I don't know if you can hear a slight rumbling. I apologize if you can hear that, but I have a rock tumbler. It's going. It's in the garage, which is right over there, so you can kind of hear it tumbling some rocks. So let's rock. Wealth inequality. So this was an old lecture. Like the economy is not good, right? Like again, there'll be a lot of parallels that I will make explicit and implicit between the 1920s and the 2020s. And obviously, the depression was not because of some kind of pandemic, and the unemployment was significantly higher. Around 25%, I think it maxed out at, which is about 10, a little less than 10 percentage points higher than the max under COVID. But there's underlying economic issues that I would have told you about 1 year ago today as well. 1 year ago being several weeks before the things really kind of hit the fan. So the underlying economic issues of the 1920s are dramatic wealth inequality. Now, of course, dramatic wealth inequality isn't a problem if you're the one with the wealth, but if you're not, it's a problem. And all things being equal, it's not good for the economy because people need to spend money to keep an economy going. When your economy is largely based on people spending their money and people don't have money, that's a problem. They turn to credit then. People turn to credit now. Layaway is back. All kinds of credit financial things are happening now, just like they did then. Um, Banks fail, stock market speculation, land speculation, all bad stuff. Agricultural overproduction, the Dust Bowl. If you go back several lectures when I talk about at several points in time, the Great American Desert, which I referenced during the Lewis and Clark lecture, I referenced during Manifest Destiny. The kind of middle part of this country doesn't get a lot of rain. It's not a great place to have agriculture because it's very windy without trees. They deal with that during the New Deal. But all of these things, land speculation, agricultural overproduction, stock market crash, all it's not like the stock market crashed in 1929 and then the Great Depression happened, right? That is a fatal error if you think that that's the case, right? That is the most symbolic cause, but it's not the like raison d'etre. It's not the like main point of how this thing happened, right? Okay, here you go. You see the unemployment. This is the Great Depression. We got Hoover's in charge back here. Roosevelt takes over. You get policies, policies, policies. He thinks he can get out, like take his foot off the gas a little bit with the spending. You get the Roosevelt recession, and then you get ultimately it's World War One right here that finally gets us gets the United States out. But the New Deal did a lot. Like the New Deal kind of did it, not only to help the economy get out of the Great Depression, but also to change the course of what the American government could do or would do or was willing to do. It's not to say that everyone liked it. I mean, the overwhelming majority of Americans liked it. But the kind of old blue blood class of Republican supporters, industrialists, etc., didn't like it. They continue to not like it, and they continue to fight this fight um, uh, well through and beyond the New Deal. Hoover doesn't do much. So, like presidents of yore, he is a hands-off, laissez-faire guy. Waits about 8 months before he does anything. Finally, does intervene in 1930. If we were in class, I would show you this, the Hawley-Smoot tariff. This is a clip from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I think if I click on it, it will it'll flag me for plagiarism or something. My turn it in score will go high. So I can't show it to you. But if you ask nicely, I'll show it to you in class. It's Ben Stein talking about Hawley-Smoot. Famous scene from the movie. So Hawley-Smoot tariff, it's a tariff. It's a big one, and it spikes retaliatory tariffs from Europe. And Hawley-Smoot is kind of like that's it. Like tariffs don't work. And in an increasingly globalized economy, an industrial economy, where retaliatory tariffs are very easy to put in place against a nation that imposes a tariff on your goods, whatever it is, it just doesn't work. And that's pretty much an understood fact, even though there's been, of late, some dalliances in reinstituting tariffs. They don't work. They don't work for major industrialized economies. They do work for smaller economies. If you're a small country that's trying to develop your steel industry, and you want to have domestic steel production, then tariffs work on some level because they help nurture the development of that industry. And you larger steel producers aren't going to really hurt you that bad. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Dawes Plan, I don't think the book gets into this. Dawes Plan was this kind of human centipede of spending and lending that was supposed to help out Germany after World War One. So the United States gives money to Germany. Germany helps production. This is Weimar Germany. Their economy increases, so they can pay off the war debt to France and England. France and England can then pay off the money that the United States lended them, and then you get the kind of thing. That plan is suspended. That's going to be a problem because it's not going to help. The Weimar economy is a nightmare as it is. So suspending the Dawes Plan is not going to help. Finally, Hoover tries to get a win with the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is effectively a kind of it's emergency loans. So it's a bailout. I don't know exactly how our book describes it. Other books describe it as a trickle down. It's not trickle down, and that's historically inaccurate. That the term doesn't even exist until the 1980s. But it's basically it's what's happening with TPP now. Well, not TPP. The PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, now under COVID. TPP is the a trade deal with the Asian nations, which also isn't happening. So it's supposed to buoy to kind of hold up businesses, keep them afloat. It's not enough. It's way more than other laissez-faire, hands-off presidents would have even imagined. It's radical. If you're Calvin Coolidge or Harding or something, this is a fairly like big step. But it's not enough. Hoover does not, as they say, he does not meet the moment. The moment demanded bold, decisive action. Hoover didn't do it. What he does do is he beats up a bunch of veterans. Bonus March, you have World War II or World War I veterans asking for their bonuses early. He sends in troops, Hoover sends in troops to get rid of them. Actually, Douglas MacArthur leads these troops. Keep his name in mind. If you've never heard that name before, he's going to be an important figure in during World War II. Not a good look, man. Not a good like beating up World War I veterans who just want some money because they're like out of work and homeless. Not a good look. So that doesn't help. Meanwhile, Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, goes and actually like serves them soup, talks with them, reads them stories. So in terms of campaign optics, as they say, Hoover is beating down veterans where Roosevelt is, Eleanor Roosevelt's there like drinking, like eating soup and reading. I mean, it wasn't Steinbeck, I suppose, at that point, but it might as well have been, right? Big PR coup for Roosevelt, not a good look for Hoover. So how does this free market respond? This miracle of laissez-faire, hands-off. Surely the market will spring to action to solve this crisis, as it always has done. Actually, it wasn't really good at it before, but well, maybe this time. Not great. Hoovervilles, so these are basically homeless encampments. There's no social safety net. Remember, it's hard to imagine. I mean, people talk about, reforming welfare or Social Security needs reform, or this, that, the other, but like none of that stuff exists. It's just like when imagine if nothing existed, right? There's nothing. And like COVID happened and like it was just like, sorry, like sorry, like there's nothing at all. You don't have health care. There's no, insurance. The government's not going to help you out at all. Just like that's the way it's supposed to work, right? Laissez-faire, sink or swim. So homeless encampments expand rapidly. Here's well, no, this is homeless college students in Virginia. So that's not the right picture. So no, okay, sorry, no, this isn't right either. This is currently this is Native American homeless encampment in Minnesota. But in 1930, okay, no, this is veterans. This is veterans in Los Angeles, homeless Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. But no, okay, no, this is Santa Ana. So this is also a homeless encampment. This is all from this year. Okay, there we go. There it is. Hoovervilles, right, 1930s. So that's a thing that we've definitely, we're not going to do that again, right? Learned from this. Hoovervilles, shanty towns, definitely not a good look, right? Because we learned about it in history class. So, yeah, so we're definitely not gonna do that again. People go hungry in cities. Meanwhile, farmers in rural areas destroy their own produce because it doesn't make sense, right? That the market, if it's not going to pay them enough to cover their costs of production, they're not going to go through with it. And as my dramatic rendering just illustrated, these are also things that happen currently. This is a New York Times headline from early on in our old pandemic days, that as people were really struggling to find milk or onions or whatever because everything was gone. The shelves were empty. Um, uh, like Venezuela or something. The shelves were empty at grocery stores. This was also happening, right? That because again, it didn't make sense. It didn't pay enough money, right? That it didn't make economic sense for people to actually go through with the supply chain to get milk or onions or whatever to the grocery stores. So they buried it underground or whatever. So again, I kind of like playing fast and loose with the historical story here. But again, the reason we study history is to try to understand how the past may inform our current moment. And without a doubt, although the circumstances are incredibly different, a lot of the things that we're seeing are very similar in 1931 and 2021. Needless to say, if you're Herbert Hoover, you're going to lose that election. And he does, like big time, big time. We're going to see other elections that are landslides. I mean, Reagan's re-election campaign, I think, was a pretty big landslide. Or maybe in 1980, his first run was similar in terms of the political map, which is interesting too because it's kind of the pendulum swinging the other direction, right? With the finally you have the kind of Hoover model of laissez-faire economics coming back in favor. I mean, at least winning an election by 1980. So we have the pendulum goes to the left in 1932 and through Roosevelt's administration. By 1980, it's going to swing the other direction. Okay, speaking of conservative and liberal politics, you have some cartoons here in the background from the time period, obviously. And this one, right, the kind of, the people who were hard on their luck were kind of excoriated for, well, why didn't you plan ahead? And people did. People put their money in savings accounts and bank accounts, and that money was being played with on the market. Here's a not very kind representation of Roosevelt, spending being his big trick. And then here's an old classic canard that it's tyranny. It's tyranny. That's always a like it's always a bit of a hyperbole. I mean, obviously, the government changed during the New Deal, but the idea that somehow it was tyranny, it didn't happen in the 1930s. It didn't happen in the 1960s. It didn't happen in the 1990s. It just kind of hasn't really happened yet. That Trojan horse hasn't really opened up. But the next time it's tyranny, probably. So what happens in this time period? The Democrats have a real Rube Goldberg contraption of support. They've got progressives, who we've learned about, right? The progressives and the populists. They've got Southerners, initially white, but then also increasingly black. They've got Northern white ethnics. So they've got people who don't like racism and people who do like racism in the same camp, and that's kind of wild, right? But it helps us understand why some of the political decisions that Roosevelt made were made. It's not like, I mean, to be fair, it's not like he otherwise would have been, kind of some kind of racial progressive, but he had to make compromises, obviously, to keep this big tent coalition together. Republicans, they're isolationists. They're just like rich people. They're some rural, like well-off rural whites. They're pro-business, pro-big ag. Largely, their power base, as you can see here from the previous map, it's the Northeast. The Republicans in this time period are a reheated version of the Whigs. or the Free Soil Party, which is a reheated version of the Whigs, which is a reheated version of the Federalists. So it kind of like there's a particular political power base in the Northeast, and that's what the Republicans are. This is the time period where we get the term liberal, meaning liberal, as in people who support government intervention in the economy to stimulate growth, government spending, et cetera, et cetera. This is not radical. This is one of the things that like that term liberal has morphed again, and that liberal is often used to describe people who are like on the left of the political spectrum. Liberals aren't left. Liberals are well within the mainstream political discourse. Just like Roosevelt, what he was doing was new in terms of it had never been done before, but he certainly wasn't a radical, right? There were people far to the left of Roosevelt who criticized him for not being far enough left. He was a liberal. Similarly, obviously people on the right didn't like him. So this is where we get that understanding of liberal that we often use today, although again, as I said, not completely accurately, where liberal in 20 years prior or all the way back to Adam Smith, liberal would have meant laissez-faire, free market liberal, right? Liberal, classical liberal, or what we would nowadays call libertarian, right? So that's that shift into the modern nomenclature now. Okay, give a sip of water here. I'm a little thirsty. Okay, there he is, Franklin Delano and Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt plays a major role in the administration. She's kind of the first lady in the model of the first ladies that we expect in the modern era. That is to say, a first lady who actually has a prominent public role, advocating for causes as kind of a companion to the president, and not just like a partnership, but also like a political companion. And Eleanor Roosevelt is more progressive than Franklin Delano. She is far more progressive on issues of race. She is more progressive on issues of gender. If we had more time, we could talk about the whole her sexuality. She was gay. I mean, the historical record is pretty firm on that one. She had a long time confidant who was probably actually her partner outside of her relationship with Franklin Delano. They had kids, so there's that. But her approach to politics was, given the constraints of the 1930s, was almost radical. I mean, it was pretty progressive. But Franklin Delano obviously did not follow suit in that regard with respect to his politics, but he did what he could, and that's a lot. There's a lot of things. The RFC and RRR, that's under Hoover, FERA, FDR, FDIC, HOLC, PWA, CCC, TVA, NRA, AAA, CWA. It's alphabet soup, as they say. A lot of programs to help stimulate the economy, get Americans back to work, and we don't need to remember all of them. I'm just going to go over the highlights here of some of the highlights. Some posters from the time period in the background. I mean, you might look at them and think it looks like kind of almost like socialist realism, the kind of posters that you would associate with the Soviet Union, or even, even Nazi Germany or Italy, or Frankist Spain. That was an aesthetic of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, in terms of like the artistic aesthetic. But it's also really important to remember that Roosevelt is not making this stuff up on his own, right? There's been decades of advocacy for the government playing a larger role in the economy. And that's not just been happening in the United States. This is AP US history, but that's been happening in Europe as well. And a lot of the ideas that Roosevelt is implementing are actually ideas that are similar to things that we're seeing implemented in not only the Soviet Union, but also in, and I hesitate to say this, but in Germany, right? Now, I'm not saying like genocidal policies, but the Autobahn, right, a nationwide freeway system that was supported by German taxpayers, that was a Nazi era development. Similarly, free schooling, education, jobs training programs, public housing programs. These are things that were being experimented with in the Soviet Union and in France and in Italy and in England, all through continental Europe and the UK. And Roosevelt is looking at all of these, and his advisors are looking at all these programs. Again, we're talking 1931, 32, 33, 34. So this is pre-Kristallnacht if we're going to talk about right, Germany. So it's apparent that Germany is increasingly like militarizing and in a way that's very, very worrisome. It's also clear that Stalin is not going to be a friend to the United States. But Roosevelt is being inspired, right, by an international scene of like what's happening internationally economically. So I'm going on and on here. We don't need to do this. Okay. The brain trust is often what it's called. He had a bunch of eggheads working on policy decisions. But it's also, again, decades of activism and also decades of failed policy. The Great Depression is kind of the last gasp of people having faith in a no holds barred free market economy. It doesn't work. Like it doesn't work. People are not happy with it, right? The 25% unemployment because of a bad economy, people want solutions to that. And these are some of them. So I'm going to go through. These are the big kind of legislative things that you should probably remember moving. And this isn't like hint, hint. I'm going to ask you about it, but it's just like these are the big ones. Glass-Steagall, 1933. It's about banking regulation. Creates the FDIC, which we still have. If you walk into a bank, you'll see a sticker on the window, FDIC insured. Insures bank deposits up to a certain amount. I don't know, 50,000 or 500,000. I don't know what it is. But if you go to a bank and you have $50,000 in the bank, you can like go in and get it. I mean, you might have to wait a little bit, but like they have the money there, right? It's not on the stock market. They're not playing with it on Wall Street. It's in the bank. It insures bank deposits. Limits reforms on speculation. That is to say, again, using the market, speculating on the market, gambling on the market. Separates commercial from investment banks. A investment bank versus a commercial bank. Commercial bank is like Deutsche Bank or something. You probably don't have a like ATM card from Deutsche Bank because they are big. They deal with big businesses, right? A lot of money, big transactions versus like your local Wells Fargo or whatever. Separates those two things because that wasn't the case before. And you had this thing where, again, local banks were using the money and investing it elsewhere was a problem. Allows for interest rate regulation. That's repealed in 1980. Interest rate regulation, meaning there were some interest rates that were simply usurious. 30, 40, 50, 60% interest on a loan, compounding very, very quickly. It's a recipe to keep poor people poor and make them more poor. That's repealed in 1980. Dodd-Frank is some legislation that's passed in the last decade that's supposed to address that. Doesn't really do it. You still can have fairly high usurious credit card rates, certainly upwards of 20%. It's not good, right? Again, if you're poor. Prevents banks from holding other financial companies. Again, this is also repealed in 1999, and this is a major factor for why we have the economic crash in '07, '08, is that what this means, banks holding other financial companies, that Wells Fargo can have Wells Fargo Financial, which Wells Fargo needs to meet certain standards of lending that Wells Fargo Financial doesn't. They can give riskier loans, they can charge higher interest rates, and they're the same thing, right? That one, the money from one funnels up to the next. That was not allowed under Glass-Steagall, or like payday lending, things like that, riskier home loans. All of this stuff was these provisions were repealed, and hence the crisis that we got in the last 10 years. So that's the banking stuff. The AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act 1933, is trying to boost agricultural prices by reducing production. It has an unintended consequence of actually being very detrimental to Southern tenant farmers, both black and white, because Southern landowners who had tenant farms, they say, well, we're going to get paid to not farm, then just have those kick them off the land, right? So they're not going to farm their land. We'll still farm our land, but we can kick them off and get money from the government, and we get rid of the tenant farmers. Sounds like a good deal to us. Black Southern tenant farmers respond by they respond with STFU, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which is a group of Southern tenant farmers, black, I think exclusively, if not certainly for the most part, who try to organize and push back against the AAA. So actually, you get people against the AAA from all sides: the poorest of the poor black tenant farmers, and also northern, very well off, large agricultural interests. Neither of them like the AAA. It ultimately does get repealed by the Supreme Court. I'm more than halfway at least here at this point. I want to get this thing done with. Okay, more stuff. Wagner Act, not Wagner Act. The Wagner Act is something very different, right? For all you classical music lovers out there, you get that joke. Allows for the organizing of labor unions federally. So we've seen dribs and drabs of this before. Certain industries allow unions, others don't. The Wagner Act makes it federal recognition of labor unions. A major part, if not the major kind of backbone of labor unions and organizing, is collective bargaining. That means to say it's not just everyone for themselves negotiating their own wage and with some kind of like, a fantastical Ayn Randian notion that you're going to make more money if you negotiate on your own, but rather, right, the argument goes, if you have 1,000 workers demanding X amount of money, the person on the other side of the table is going to be more willing to negotiate with you. That's collective bargaining. It makes that legal, which was not always the case before, right? With the first use of the Sherman Antitrust Act, if we remember, the first time it's actually put into practice is to break up labor unions and their collective organizing or collective bargaining. It's not all good if you're a fan of labor unions, because this excludes domestic and agricultural workers. Why is that a problem? Because domestic and agricultural workers are overwhelmingly black, right? So again, this is a nod to the Southern Democrats in the sense that, remember, the South is largely agricultural. So if the Wagner Act is an issue, it's for Northern industrialists. It's not an issue for Southerners, wealthy Southerners, because tenant farmers, agricultural workers, domestic workers are not included, right? Can you imagine if all those tenant farmers organized, right, and started collective bargaining, maybe even black and white? That would be a big problem. So again, this is the kind of like the dark side of the New Deal. A lot of people stand for Roosevelt and the New Deal, and they don't mention all of these other things that were not necessarily really super great. Social Security, we know it. We still have it. It provides for unemployment benefits, retirement, disability, Medicaid, all of these things. Roosevelt administration and then later Truman, they also push for universal health care. The rest of the developed and developing world pushes for it as well and gets it. But Roosevelt stopped short of actually getting it. And then they try later, all the way through Johnson, all the way through Clinton, Obama. It's been a kind of ongoing thing. But Medicaid, which is a kind of government assisted health care, is part of Social Security. That's 1935. Also excludes domestic and agricultural workers. So again, Fair Labor Standards Act is 1938. Minimum wage, overtime pay, prevents child labor. So these are all kind of like big deal pieces of legislation, right? The big ones that fail are the NRA and the AAA. AAA I went over just a second ago. It's about agriculture and trying to establish baseline prices and discourage production and having people paid for not producing. The NRA is effectively the industrial equivalent of the AAA. AAA is agricultural, NRA is industrial. They're both voted down by the Supreme Court. So again, this highlights the limits of what Roosevelt can do because of the Constitution, right? Because you can't do that stuff, right? There's just the Constitution protects the separation of the federal government and the executive branch in particular and private business in ways that Roosevelt's trying to do things to help the economy or to help workers. They're just not, it's not allowed, right? Other things are more allowed. Tennessee Valley Authority. This is the Roosevelt administration at its most Soviet, right? So like again, he's not a socialist. He's a like liberal, progressive, maybe Democrat. But when you look at the TVA, you're like, man, this is some Soviet. This is like some big time Soviet public works type thing. It is effectively trying to industrialize the South and provide cheap electricity. So again, it's a free market solution in the sense that the government's going to come in, federal government, and build dams and hydroelectric power. It's going to employ a bunch of people in the process, which is good because all these people are out of work. It's going to create a bunch of infrastructure, which is going to pay dividends economically, socially, culturally for decades and decades to come, because this infrastructure is going to actually help the economy, right, in the long run. And also, it's going to compete with energy companies that the thinking is are charging too much money for their power. So the federal government comes in, builds this thing, and then they set a price that is lower than the price of the private electric companies. And that's how the free market works, right? They have to compete, right? That's the thinking of the TVA. And it does employ a lot of people, it creates infrastructure, it helps to industrialize Tennessee and that kind of rural region of Appalachia in the South. TVA, kind of a big deal when we think of the New Deal. I'm going to go through the next ones very quickly. They're in your book. You should review them. But these are the ones that you should like remember. Works Progress Administration does a bunch of stuff. It puts construction workers back to work, and masons and carpenters. It puts artists to work making sculptures. It puts poets to work writing poetry, recording. It puts one of the major things of the WPA is what's his name? Alan Lomax, if I have that right. Goes through the South and records old blues music, right? That formerly enslaved musicians were singing, and all of the spoken word and the various songs that people were. It was none of it had been recorded before. So you name it, artists, poets, construction workers, carpenters. WPA puts them all back to work building dams, building statues, building bridges, writing poetry, painting pictures, you name it. And it's a way to get the economy going because once those people start working, they pay taxes, right? And those taxes get funneled back into the economy. So it's kind of like jump starting, right, the economy through these works programs. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, planting trees. If you've ever gone hiking in Southern California, you've hiked on a CCC trail. All of the trail, really nationwide, all of the trails are at some point, right, were built by the CCC. People, largely young men, going out, camping, working, building trees, building trails, building lookout observation towers, clearing brush, you name it. Puts a bunch of people to work. My grandfather actually worked in the CCC with Pete Seeger, who was a musician who was more like in this vein, but put a lot of people back to work. Getting out, and the CCC still exists. I think California has the California Conservation Corps. So again, putting people back to work, doing stuff, building I mean, in a sense, this is infrastructure. How are you going to prevent the next Dust Bowl? You got to have trees, right? So the CCC goes out through the middle of the country and plants all of these windbreak, right, big trees that will help prevent the wind from coming through and blowing all the dirt away. Industry. People get back to work, right? Whether it's the WPA, the TVA, the CCC, the NRA, you name it, there are people getting back to work. Both of these pictures are of the Rouge River plant. The black and white is from the 30s. The color is from more recently. I think the Rouge plant is gone now, but this is probably from the 1990s. World War II is really the thing that finally gets everyone back into the economy. But the New Deal helps a lot. Part of what we need to understand when we're learning about this time period is that the scale of industry was different. Right? People talk now, oh, the Green New Deal or this, that, the other, or, we're going to clean energy. Yeah, that's all fine and well if you think that's going to help the economy and certainly would put people back to work. But we're talking about, to give the example of the River Rouge plant, the River Rouge plant in 1931 employed 100,000 people in one plant. And it was a plant that went from boatloads of iron ore being offloaded at the docks to fully made cars being rolled out the other end. The entire operation was under one roof. It was obviously multiple roofs, but 100,000 people working at this plant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Ford Motor Company now, or the last time I checked, employs 202,000 people globally. 100,000 people in one plant. So when we're talking about stimulating the economy or getting people back to work in 1931, it's a really different conversation than getting people back to work in an economy, the 21st century American economy, which is largely service-based, right? It's people work in restaurants, or there's small businesses that, 20, 30 employees, something like that. It's a different game, right? So that's important for understanding contemporary political conversations, but it's also important for understanding just how, I don't want to say easy, but it was easier. Right? It's easier to put people back to work when you have factories that could employ 100,000 people. That's a lot of people, right? Once the economy gets going, you can make a lot of cars, or what ultimately becomes planes and tanks and things like that, right? In these same factories. So that's an important kind of counterpoint. in the last two slides here, right, the not so great side of the New Deal. I've mentioned some of them already. The image in the background is actually a homeowners loan corporation, which is a New Deal era program that was about giving home loans. And as you see, this is Los Angeles, and there are areas of the map that are outlined in red. Right? That's where we get the term redlining. We'll learn more about that in the next chapters, definitely in period 8, where these are neighborhoods that are not good, right? That real estate agents just draw them in red. And if you're in this neighborhood, you can't get a home loan. If you're in this neighborhood, it's difficult to move out because you can't move here or here or definitely not here or here. So it effectively, what the New Deal did, while it was doing all of these things to help put people back to work and stimulate the economy and expand the size of government, social safety net, all that stuff, it was also creating a recipe for a ghetto, right? For ghettos across the country by literally, right, drawing lines around the bad neighborhoods. Mexican and Mexican American book talks about repatriation, but it says Mexican migrants. It wasn't just Mexican migrants. They rounded up a lot of people who were actually American citizens and repatriated them. Folks just who didn't have ID on them and spoke Spanish or had an accent, rounded up and sent to Mexico. Again, because the government didn't want to extend benefits to non-white people. Again, this goes for black Southerners as well. FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, again helps white workers buy homes or refinance. A lot of people are struggling to pay their mortgages, so the FHA helps them refinance. A lot of people want to buy homes. The FHA helps them. Doesn't help black homeowners, even people who had the money to do it, right? Couldn't do it. Again, widens the gap between the financial gap between people of color and white people. Largely, we're talking about black Americans. The example here in the background and my first example here of Mexican repatriation is applicable to the West Coast. But outside of the West Coast, it's pretty much, we're talking black and white still in this time period. As I mentioned, HULC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, refinance mortgages, new mortgages only to white homeowners, doesn't lend to black neighborhoods. So again, these are the areas outlined in red. If you see here, the street is Alameda, the Alameda Corridor it was known as, and literally one side of the street is all black, the other side of the street is here's Alameda, sorry, other side is all white. This is a bad neighborhood, this is a good neighborhood. It's literally the other side of the street. So that is something that we might be familiar with in the 21st century. The foundation is laid for that in this time period. Tidings McDuffie, big dub for Filipino sovereignty. So the Philippines, who have been an American protectorate since the Spanish-American War, 1898, are now independent. So awesome, that seems good, and it is great, good. But it's largely motivated again by the notion that if the Philippines are the only part of Asia that can migrate to the United States because they're actually kind of part of America. It's not China, it's not Japan or Korea. Well, Korea is Japan, I suppose, in this time period. But the Philippines is that one exception. By granting them sovereignty, suddenly they're their own nation, and Filipinos don't have the ability to migrate to the United States and travel freely in the United States. So again, not a great look. And we haven't even gotten to Japanese internment yet. So you talk about bad looks for the Roosevelt administration, that's a really bad one. I'll close with a kind of case study that highlights the contradiction of what the Roosevelt administration is trying to do, and in particular with housing. And that is to, on the one hand, provide equal access but also expand opportunity. The case study here is Detroit. There's a very good book that's all about this. If you're a history major in college, you'll read it. If you want to know more about it, you can ask me, but it's not relevant for our needs here. This on the left is a housing project. Housing projects in the United States have a very bad rep, and rightfully so, because they've been really defunded and marginalized and ghettoized. Where social housing, as they would call it in other places of the world, Austria, Paris, Germany, is actually really nice. Like it's actually really nice. It's government subsidized housing that's well below the market value, just like housing projects are, but they're not like ghetto communities. They're like really nice. But that distinction happens post-war. And then here we have a freeway. Freeways also help to exacerbate the contradictions of the New Deal. Okay, so what does the New Deal try to do? It tries to help the most disadvantaged gain access to housing. That's good. Social works, social welfare, housing assistance. This is largely Black Americans or Mexican Americans in Southern California. This is about equal access and opportunity, right? The idea that civil rights, it didn't happen. It wasn't even imaginable pre-1865. It didn't happen during Reconstruction, that we've never seen a time period where African Americans had the opportunity to even attempt to be treated as equal. And what the New Deal is trying to do, in the North at least, is address that, right? Provide equal access and opportunity through things like public housing, which again, in the 1930s isn't the 1980s. Public housing is happening in England, in Austria, in France, in Germany, and it's seen as, if you're in a moderately successful nation, this is something that the nation should do, right? Help to build housing that if you live in this country, you have some kind of benefit of, right, publicly provided housing that's cheaper than, right, the free market options, which are going to be always, the prices are always going to go up because that's how, right, markets work. Okay, well that's fine and well. This is people, we read about Ossian Sweet in the Carol Anderson article. This is not Ossian Sweet, right? So Ossian Sweet had the money. I mean, look how it turned out for him. But these are people who actually do need, right, assistance. Excuse me. Okay. On the other hand, the New Deal wants to expand opportunities and rights to those that already have them. So this is largely white homeowners through FHA loans, through Hulk refinancing, things like that. So people who already own homes want to protect their property rights. They want to protect ownership. They want to protect the privileges of ownership. And again, these are the whites that don't want Ossian Sweet in their neighborhood, right? Because they don't want to have their property values go down, as we talked about. So obviously the issue here is a fundamental contradiction. And it's a contradiction that really, excuse me, really plagues the New Deal. That given, you can cut it one or two ways, right? We can either assume that racism, structural racism, systemic racism exists, and then you're obviously going to look at these two options and say, well, one of these things is not going to happen, right? You can't have it both ways. You can't have equal access and expanded opportunity for Black Americans and have the protection of property. You could if you didn't have racism, right? So if racism didn't exist, you could definitely do both of these things. Would not be a problem at all. You could build public housing for poor people, largely African Americans in Detroit, right next to a neighborhood that was middle class, upper middle class, homeowners, largely white. All good, no problem. Bake cookies for the new neighbors, right? But it isn't the case, right? That's not the case. So this points to one of the real problems of what is a very ambitious agenda for Roosevelt and the New Deal. It's just not going to happen, right? This is one example of housing, but you can look at similar examples with workplace discrimination and job opportunities, with freedom of movement. There's all kinds of ways in which it's because of the deep rooted structures of racism that existed. You just can't do it, right? If those structures of racism didn't exist, yeah, definitely you could do this. And that's why we see, right, in places like, say, Vienna, right, which has an extremely homogenous population up until really the last 20 years, you can have it both ways. That working class Viennese do get social housing that is very, very, I mean, very nice. And I think even to today, I think 60% of people in Vienna live in social housing, what we would call public housing. And they're like really, really nice. But you can also then expand home ownership for people who did own their homes because you don't have that underlying issue of race. Obviously, Vienna, like things get set back a little bit in the 1930s and 40s. But once the World War II is over, again, they go back to their policies. So again, New Deal changes government, does a lot of things that a lot of folks would say are very good. Certainly changes the game when it comes to American politics. However, well, the overwhelming majority of Americans are convinced, if I go back just briefly to this slide here, right? Black Americans start voting for Democrats. I mean, can you imagine? That shows you how popular Roosevelt is, that black Southerners are voting for a Democrat. Like, that's kind of crazy, right? They're not voting for the party of Lincoln anymore. Democrats control the legislative branch until 1947. They control the executive until 1952. We're looking at a map of 1932 here, right? So that tells you that these programs are incredibly popular, right? That the seismic shift of American government is very popular with the overwhelming majority of voters. However, it's not to say that, like, I mean, it would seem as though the debate is over, right? That the laissez-faire folks have been, eviscerated with facts and logic from 20 years of popular legislative victories, but that's not the case, right? And what we'll see in period 8 is a rolling back of New Deal policies with the aim of something more akin to what the United States had in, say, 1925 than what they had in 1945 at the end of World War II. World War II is what we'll learn about next. It is the thing that eventually gets the United States finally out of the Great Depression. But it is also a economic recovery that is largely built upon the policies, the policy decisions, and the economic decisions of the New Deal. So the two things are really very much linked, one and the other. That is 58 minutes, well, in 9 seconds it will be. So that's a longer lecture than I would have liked to have had, but now I'm stalling for time to make it even, and that is exactly 58 minutes.